It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
To put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white.
What's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
What could be a difference here from other conflicts, you know, that could seem very far away, you know, in Africa or Middle East or whatever. I mean, these are Europeans that we're seeing being killed.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, you know, like Iraq or Afghanistan. You know, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
The media coverage of this has been biased and insanely problematic from the outset. It's like, what do you mean relatively civilized, unlike Iraq or Afghanistan? What? Not a place that you would hope this would happen? So does that mean you would hope that it continues in the Middle East? It's kind of crazy that the bias just comes out. They're not even trying to hide it. There's such a double standard. You feel pained when they're light-skinned white Europeans with blue eyes, but do you not feel the same pain when they're a little darker and they have darker hair? The point of this is not to take any attention away from the crisis in Ukraine. We should care. The point is, why do we care more when it happens in Europe than outside of Europe? It took 5 days for the strictest of sanctions to hit Russia, to try to destroy their economy. But there are crises that have been going on for decades, but no real economic punishment or action was taken there. Why the double standard? Western media is making it clear that it prioritizes white Christian people over everyone else. If you don't fall under that category, then you aren't civilized and you aren't worthy of entering safety. You're not worthy. The borders are open for Ukrainians. Basically every neighboring country. When they flee war, then they're welcomed with open arms. But when, say, Syrians flee war, then the borders are closed. They have to sleep outside of the border in freezing temperatures. They've got nowhere to run to, basically abandoned, right? The US and Russia collectively bombed the heck out of Syria. The West doesn't cry out for those civilians that are killed. It doesn't cry out for the children that are killed, the women who are raped, who have nowhere to go and nowhere to stay. There's been a huge refugee crisis. They've been facing a civil war for, 10 years? But no, the borders are closed. European borders are closed. Because the argument is that, oh, you know, they're the terrorists. We're worried about national security. They're fleeing from the terrorism. And you helped destroy their country. And then you hear the European nations make this argument that, oh, you know, we're only helping out our neighbor, right? The neighbor argument. But if everyone only helps their immediate neighbors, then that's no better than barbarism. Are you not going to care if somebody's a little further away from your country, just across a 1-hour flight? So if a conflict takes place outside of Europe, say Latin America, say Africa, say Asia, right? If it happens anywhere else, then it doesn't receive the same attention. The lives aren't valued the same way. But the second that something happens in Ukraine, there's international outrage. We've got a live stream. We can watch what's going on, right? Like as if this was some type of spectacle to just see. But that's besides the point. We have a live stream. We've got international support. We've got sanctions. We pick who we want to support. We pick which lives are valuable. That's what the media is doing. And FIFA, who claims not to be involved in politics, punished players in the past for bringing up political issues. There's a player who brought up the fact that certain Arabs were facing apartheid and ethnic cleansing. Their land was being annexed, but that player was fine. But now a player lifted up his shirt to reveal a message that said something like, "No war in Ukraine," and he was like unanimously supported and lauded. He was a hero. So it's not that politics are out of the picture. It's just that certain politics aren't allowed. Only European interests are allowed. FIFA does include politics, only the ones that are relevant to Europe. The media can decide which cause is humanitarian. There was a New York Times op-ed or an article that, the Ukrainians look like us. They watch Netflix. They use Instagram. So that's the criteria for caring about someone? How shallow and superficial can we be? Right? Obviously, psychologically, you relate more to people who are like you and who look like you. But is that the extent of our empathy? Is that what we've come to?
Leaders from the continent have said that they are disturbed at reports that African citizens have been refused crossing to safety over the Polish border. The African Union said that singling out Africans trying to escape war would be shockingly racist and called on all countries to show the same amount of empathy to all victims of the conflict.
We were told that they are not allowing the blacks to get on board. So if you're a black and then you go there, you're wasting your time.
To make matters worse, there are African international students or just African Ukrainians who are living there and also trying to flee the conflict, but they're not allowed to because the white Ukrainians are being favored. There are videos on Twitter of them being denied. Students being threatened by bus drivers, threatened to be run over. They're yelling out that, we're students. They're not allowed onto the trains. They're just standing on the tracks. Everybody else gets to go, but they don't. Are their lives worth less? How come everyone else is prioritized before them? There's a woman with a baby, and she's not allowed to leave either. There are reports of animals leaving before African citizens or African people. And that's the extent of the hypocrisy. That's the extent of the bias. Why do you think Black Lives Matter exists? It's not just America that's racist. You have them walking for hours and they're stranded. See the link below for testimonials of African people who were just neglected. It's the same conflict. They're also in Ukraine. But some people get to leave and some people don't. Some lives are valued more than others, or some lives aren't valued at all. But then the media coverage of the actual situation, what gets glorified and what doesn't, it really reveals our biases. For example, the citizens are praised for taking up arms. They're praised for fighting back against the Russian troops. Anywhere else in the world you take up arms against someone who's taking over your country, you're sent to jail. But if you do it in Europe, that's totally okay. You're heroic. You're great. You're defending your country. The Defense Ministry of Ukraine is tweeting out, teaching citizens, average citizens, to make Molotovs, kind of explosive, kind of fiery devices to harm Russian troops, to fight Russian troops. This is being encouraged. Anywhere else in the world, if you were to teach the citizens to make Molotovs, forget Molotovs, even fight back against army troops, you'd be called a terrorist. Anywhere else. But it's okay if the Europeans do it because they're civilized. Right? They're allowed to do it. It's this disgusting concept of white is right, white is civilized. That goes back so many generations and has been so harmful. And the fact that these reporters are shocked that this is happening in Europe is mind-blowing. Because have you studied history at all? People like Trevor Noah have done well to point this out. Conflict and war is literally Europe's thing. Europe has more blood on its hands than everybody else, basically. I mean, who started the world wars? Who colonized the world? Are you going to forget about Leopold II and what he did to the Congo? Are you going to forget about the transatlantic slave trade? Are you going to forget about that oppression? Are we going to forget about the Holocaust? That happened in Europe. Are we going to forget about the Protestants and the Catholics tearing each other apart for centuries? Right? It's only now. We're just deceived that in the 21st century, Europe is experiencing peace. We forget all about its history. We shouldn't be deluded by the time period that we're living in, or the circumstances that we currently find ourselves in. But now, every single thing that happens, every single human rights violation is against the Ukrainians is magnified. It has gained so much importance. But there have been human rights violations going on before this conflict that have been ignored and neglected. How can we cherry pick which conflicts and which lives we want to save? How can we cherry pick which lives are valuable? Who gave us that right? How can we choose some lives at the expense of others? How come some refugees are allowed in and some aren't when they're both fleeing a conflict that in ways are very similar? It's not just about skin color. Edward Said, if only he were around to see this conflict, I wonder what he'd say about the biases, the Western narrative that's been going on for centuries, the civilized West and the uncultured, stagnant, uncivilized East. But it's more complicated than just skin color. Do American politicians actually care about Ukrainian lives? I don't know. Because what if it's just about political interests? What if these politicians just don't want Russia to expand? Are the lives valuable, or is it geopolitical interests? Is it about getting Ukraine to join NATO? Where is the empathy? Is there empathy? If they actually cared about human lives and like humanitarian crises, then there are plenty of places to look, right? Yemen right now is facing the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Do we talk about it? No. Does the American media address it? No, but we certainly played a role in getting it to the place where it is. Without a government, we played a role in its destruction. We played a role in the fact that now there are child soldiers. Like, which conflicts do we focus on and why? What about the Bosnian genocide? That also happened in Europe. But do we talk about that? Did the West spotlight that? It's problematic if we can just sweep certain lives under the rug and not bat an eye when those lives were taken. All in all, this conflict reveals a lot about who gets the spotlight, who gets the attention, who receives help first, who doesn't receive help, what triggers our empathy, what doesn't. It's a sad chapter in humanity. I don't like talking about politics, but I felt this issue needed to be addressed. I felt that this bias needed to be addressed, especially in the context of culture, imperialism, and orientalism, right? Because this narrative is an orientalist narrative, that the civilized, white, Christian, blue-eyed Europeans need to be saved, and that conflict happens in the Middle East, and Africa, and Asia, or Latin America, and should stay there. That is an orientalist narrative, like Edward Said said. We can't expect the West to define our issues, or define our circumstances, to depict us accurately, let alone value non-Western lives. In the context of the rest of the world and biased reporting, I'll leave you with a quote from Malcolm X that is still relevant today, again, in the context of the rest of the world, not in the context of Ukraine, but in the context of biased reporting. Malcolm X once said, "If you're not careful, the media will have you hating the people who are oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing." Who are the oppressed? And who needs our help? Will the media be accurate? Who will challenge the Orientalist narrative?